And now, Deep Thoughts by Brad and Gary.
Hello and welcome to the Not Ready for Primetime Project. We're Gary Seath and Brad Robinson.
And you're not.
This week on Deep Thoughts, Brad, we're talking about the end of the early years, but as it pertains to Lorne in particular.
Because you can't talk enough about Lorne. I know you love Lorne.
Look, let me put aside my feelings about Lorne and just say that it's important to get the perspective of what he was going through and what his thoughts were leading into season 5 and then after that.
Yes, and there's no one aside from the man himself better to talk to, I would say, than Susan Morrison, who wrote the phenomenal book last year, Lorne, the man who invented Saturday Night Live. So Susan was nice enough to come back to us and talk about exactly what you said, Lorne's mentality and what he was thinking going into season 5 and throughout season 5 and the whole Gene Domanian decision and just where that left him and what he did after. And so it was really great to talk to her about the Lorne side of it. So we should say, if you're not familiar with season 5 and how this all came to an end, this really is a companion piece to our last episode where we talked to Doug and Jeff, where we really just kind of spell out the nuts and bolts of what happened and why it happened and why NBC made their choices and why the show did what it did. So if you're not as familiar as the whole reasons to why Lorne left or was not brought back after season 5, listen to our last episode with Doug and Jeff and then listen to this because we don't really dive into the specifics in this.
Right. But it is a great conversation with Susan, who is so knowledgeable and a lot of fun to talk to. So you're going to enjoy this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Susan Morrison, thank you for joining us again. It's great to speak with you again.
Happy to be back. Always fun talking about Lorne.
Thank you.
So as we're wrapping up the early years of the show, we wanted to bring you on to talk to you about Lorne and going into season 5, kind of what his mentality was. I know he had Guild Alive going on, and he knew that John wasn't coming back to the show. And then more importantly, maybe Dan decides not to come back. So how was Lorne feeling going into that season?
He was completely exhausted going into season 5. After Animal House came out, you know, the show had a huge bump because a lot of people came to the show through Animal House. Lorne had a phrase for that. He called it the undeserved audience. And of course, he's a guy who's always cared about ratings, so he liked the numbers. But I'm not sure he really loved being popular in that mass way, you know? He's a guy who likes a clubhouse. He likes an in crowd. Mm-hmm. And it sort of chafed with him to have, you know, every high school kid at his locker imitating Mr. Bill. I mean, I think that sort of chafed his sort of more rarefied, pretentious, to use a word he himself would use, sensibilities. So he was worn down. In the first 5 years, also, you have to remember, he hadn't really hit on the formula for SNL as we know it today, which is that it's almost like a sports franchise. You have stars who retire. You have rookies on the bench. You build it up and tear it down, and it's always in flux. He didn't really, you know, he had to learn that on the job. That's why it was so cataclysmic for him when Chevy left, because he was like, oh my God, my star left. It hadn't occurred to him yet. They had to keep seeding the ranks. So, you know, he had this big audience of Animal House frat boys watching, and yet his stars were one by one leaving him. And the other thing I think that was painful for him is that they were leaving and having these mega successes that he had nothing to do with, either creatively or financially. You know, he resented Animal House because he thought that there was like a shadow marketing campaign, that it was like an SNL movie, but it wasn't an SNL movie. It just said Belushi. And that's why Lorne had been kind of pissed off when Landis wanted to get Aykroyd in that movie. So everyone was sort of peeling off, you know, in the way it might be in Lorne's frame of mind, like kind of going to a cooler party than the one that he was invited to, you know, leaving him there with all the mess. And of course, the emotions and the rivalry, I mean, not to mention the drugs, were all just amping up in the 4th and 5th season. People were jealous, you know, they saw John as a huge star. Chevy had left and was becoming a star. You know, everyone was sort of, you know, this was a period Lorraine Newman talks about how they all were coming up with their own production companies, you know, what to name their production production companies, and they were all getting in this sort of Hollywood business frame of mind, and the innocence had gone out of it. And anyway, Lorne was exhausted. He also was thinking, well, when am I going to get to start my auteur period? You know, he had always hoped to make a movie like The Graduate. He really, you know, he was a cinephile back in Canada, you know, and had run this underground film festival. And I think he thought that's really what his path was going to be. So he was getting itchy more and more. I think he felt it's sort of like the way you hear what public school teachers say today, that more and more his job was kind of like being a disciplinarian, you know, keeping people in check, preventing people from ODing, you know, preventing them from fighting. You know, this was the year after Chevy came back to host and got in the fist fight with Bill Murray backstage. You know, it was so, you know, and everyone, as he said to me, everybody started to get what they want. You know, John had got the movies. Gilda, like Lorne, was a theater kid, you know, a theater nerd, and she always wanted Broadway. The Gilda Live thing turned out to be it did okay on Broadway, but it didn't get great reviews. It turned out to be the first film in the deal he had made, the movie deal he had made, and that was a total flop. He had originally hoped to direct it himself, you know, sort of begin his Hollywood auteur moment, but in a kind of a weird sort of fluke, which I think probably both simultaneously pained and pleased him, Mike Nichols ended up directing it. Nichols was his idol, so that was kind of exciting getting to work with Mike Nichols. But Nichols had never done anything live. You know, this was completely out of his wheelhouse, and it just crashed and burned. It was an inauspicious beginning for Lorne's film career. So he was going into that season run down, exhausted, kind of looking for the exit door himself. As the season went on, the negotiations with the network got really difficult. Fred Silverman, you know, he had pioneered these very popular, like they call them jiggle shows, you know, shows with a lot of young busty women in them. And he viewed SNL as a farm team. You know, he was trying to pull Gilda out of that cast and give her her own show. And again, Lorne was very territorial, very angry about that. He always saw himself as apart from the mainstream pablum of what the network was doing, and he resented being pulled into that. So, you know, he was not getting along with the network and those executives, and those negotiations were making it harder and harder to feel good about it.
You mentioned the Hollywood of it all, and I was curious, so many people have talked about it, and I wonder how much Lorne was at this time looking beyond the show. You mentioned the movie deal and his wanting to do something. Everybody, cast and writer-wise, when you hear about this fifth season at the end of the show, everyone's looking what's next. And how much of that at all was playing into Lorne of I've done my job on the show, and I want to take that next step?
I think he was completely ready to start the movie part of his career. He had this deal with, I guess it was Orion. He signed with John Calley, who he met through Candice Bergen, you know, and with Lorne, those kinds of connections and pedigrees are always really important. Friend of a friend, you know, somebody, I mean, he would much rather have signed with, and Calley was kind of an intellectual. He told me a great story, which is in my book, about how when he first met with Calley, he told him that about this idea he had for doing an adaptation of Pride and Prejudice. You know, again, you know, 20, 30 years before that became a real thing.
Right.
Lorne definitely had a kind of an English major, high culture strand in his cultural diet, you know. So he was excited about doing this Jane Austen update. And the day after that first meeting with Calley, he went home and hand-delivered to his apartment, he said, was a first edition of Pride and Prejudice. You know, it's a pretty classy, very, you know, expensive, high-end Hollywood gift. So he thought, okay, it's all coming together. I've got the classy studio, the classy executive. I get to do a Jane Austen project. You know, it would be many years before he sort of finally realized that the kind of mark he would be able to make in Hollywood was with like Tommy Boy and Wayne's World. And it isn't what he originally thought he was going to do. And he's defensive in an interesting way about those films now. You know, Wayne's World was panned by the New York Times in the beginning. Tommy Boy was on, Siskel and Ebert's worst of the year. And he'll say, he thinks that there is a real built-in kind of snobbery to the American critical establishment. He'll say big comedies never win Oscars. I mean, Annie Hall and what else? They just don't. So, but anyway, at the beginning, he wanted to do, he had a more indie kind of frame of mind. And I'm jumping ahead a little bit, like within a year or so after he left the show, he would start working on a screenplay called Women, Money, and Restaurants, which people around him always found hilarious because, those were his interests. And I think it was a kind of I think he envisioned it as a graduate / Woody Allen coming of age, a transplant to New York City.
Write what you know.
Navigating the restaurant scene, it doesn't seem, a draft of that screenplay does not seem to exist, although I did have this British guy named Frank Rodham, who I think he made Quadrophenia, who was briefly working with Lorne on that project. I tracked him down. He went so far as to go out into his storage unit in the suburbs outside of London and ransacked it, but could not find a copy. Oh. That would be a great document.
Oh my God, yes.
So getting back to season 5, though, itself, right? We talked about the loss of Danny being huge and then kind of bringing in Harry Shearer and all of that.
Oh, yeah.
You were watching the show at that point, right? You were a fan of season 5. Yeah. How was that received, for the fandom at that time?
Season 5. I might have been living in England. I was living in England during season 5, I think. So I was not watching it, but
you were that upset that you just had to get away.
She's like, the writing's on the wall. I'm out.
No, I was in graduate school, but I watched it. I watched probably the first 4 seasons really religiously. Mm-hmm. I remember that feeling of it. What I was talking about, the post Animal House undeserved audience, when it was just huge. And this is when, there was the lawsuit over Mr. Bill. There were just everything was getting kind of big and corporate, and that bummed Lorne out. I don't really remember watching the Harry Shearer season. So most of my knowledge of that just comes from reporting, but I certainly talked a lot to all those people who were there, Jim Downey. I mean, I know Harry. Harry used to write a column for me at Spy Magazine. And Al Franken, poor Al, who's the one who suggested Harry. I think he's very defensive about the fact that all these years later, Lorne blames him. And what everyone said is basically that Harry was just not a team player. I think that because he had been a child actor, he had a sort of a whole lot of different showbiz protocols that he was used to doing. And the sort of Darwinian, drug-fueled chaos of how the show comes together really didn't sit well with him. He saw it as a sort of a strange little fiefdom where every decision was made impractically at the whim of like a little emperor, and and most people on that show, they were really green. They were brand new. They didn't question the way Lorne did it. And what I think is interesting is, it isn't, there aren't the drugs, and I don't think you have the same kind of backstage animosity and jealousy now that you did then. But the show still does operate in a way that is, very counterintuitive in terms of just like the logic of running a show. Jim Downey likes to say, if you sat down with a group from the Army Corps of Engineers and said, okay, these are the things we have to do for every episode, they would say, okay, well, you need 11 days to do that. And, but in fact, they do it in 6, and it's chaotic and it's capricious. And, as I think I argue in my book, even though it doesn't really make sense, you'd never sit down and draft a plan, do it this way. Part of that chaos and tumult is what makes the show work. It's kind of the secret sauce of the, the fact that it feels like the Hunger Games, keeps everybody keeps everybody going.
Yeah. We had a couple of questions about season 5, but since you weren't around for that, the only one thing I did want to ask, if you were watching before then in season 4, we're always curious, as fans of SNL at that time, did people actually know who Fred Silverman was? In season 4, John's doing the Fred Silverman impressions. Obviously, Limo for Lamo is, a lot of people say the crutch when Franken does it on Weekend Update. But as a regular just viewer of the show, do you remember even knowing who that was?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, these days, because of the internet and, regular people read the trades, regular people know a lot about the inner workings of show business. Back then, nobody did. And that's a good point. To send up the network president for Al to do that, I mean, that, people didn't know, but it didn't matter that it didn't know, because Lorne's whole idea was, there were two things, speaking truth to power, whether that's Ronald Reagan or Jimmy Carter or the president of the network. And he also, one of the things that made the show so radical from the beginning was this kind of breaking down the fourth wall, kind of meta-ness of it. And as I went to the show in the first season when I was 16, and the thing that struck me, I probably didn't get most of the jokes, was just that I was in a working studio with the cameras flying around. And I think that bringing, in that episode that I went to, which was Elliot Gould.
Yeah.
And that had the famous Star Trek sketch where Gould plays a network executive coming in and telling Shatner, played by Belushi, that the show is canceled. So from the very beginning, it was doing meta stuff about the network and about the network bosses. So the viewers of SNL would have been familiar with that. And they would have thought of it as just like sticking it to the suits in a generic way. It doesn't really matter if they knew who Fred Silverman was. They just knew he was the big bad boss who cared about money and didn't care about, artistic freedom. And so that's a stock character, I mean, there are characters like that in Chaplin's Modern Times, right? So that's why it works. You don't have to know Fred Silverman's resume.
Okay.
He's just the big bad corporate.
We spoke to Doug and Jeff about the negotiations and kind of play-by-play of all of that. We wanted to ask you Lorne's side of that, and mostly the blindsidedness of it. We talked that Lorne found out in Texas that Gene Domanian was taking the job. So we're just kind of curious on how Lorne both found out and then took that news of kind of being blindsided by Gene.
Yeah, no, that was interesting. I talked to him about it. I also heard about that from Susan Forrestal, who was there. It was his wife at the time. I think, it is interesting, one of the things that makes Lorne such a good character is that he's always been able to put himself across in the culture as both a rebel and a patriarch, kind of at the same time. And even after doing that show for 5 years and winning a bunch of Emmys and being really successful, he was strangely green. He was very naive. And it's a little bit surprising that Bernie Brillstein, who was a seasoned Hollywood player, when I think back on it, to me, it's a little surprising that Bernie didn't, wasn't guiding him better, because Lorne, after creating the show, doing it for 5 years, it never seemed to even have occurred to him that it wasn't his property. The network owned it. He wasn't sophisticated in a business way to even really know that. And he just assumed out of some kind of Canadian, Boy Scoutiness that it was his thing. It was his show. And that if he wasn't going to do it anymore, that they would take it off the air. That just seems sort of like a good faith. But if you think about it, that's extremely naive. It was a very valuable franchise for the network. So he's negotiating and thinking that he'll just prevail in his, kicking it down the road, Fabian strategy kind of way. And I really don't think it occurred to him that this whole other thing could happen. So he, there was the blow up of the Limo for Lamo. There was a meeting with Fred Silverman that was derailed because Al Franken insulted the network president on the air. But then it was going to be rescheduled. And, I think he thought, like everything, it would just simmer down and we will get on with the negotiations. And what Lorne was asking for was not so crazy. He just wanted a few months off to regroup. He was burned out. He wanted to bring in some new cast. So I guess that makes sense. But so then he goes off to Texas on the private jet with some of his rich friends to the opening of Urban
Cowboy, right?
Urban Cowboy. And I guess Barry Diller takes him aside. Barry Diller in a big cowboy hat at Gillies, the mechanical bull bar. I mean, the idea of hearing of Lorne, Mr. Button Down, in this crazy honky-tonk in Houston with Jerry Hall and, think your worst nightmare, Barry Diller dressed as a cowboy coming over to tell you the news that you've lost your show, your life's work. And Lorne felt so completely betrayed because he had no idea that they were even thinking that the show would go on without him, that it was in fact even theirs. And the Gene Domanian piece of it especially stung because Gene was somebody who he hired in the second season, I think, at Woody Allen's suggestion. Again, Lorne loved the fancy connection. Woody invited to a party and said, "You got to meet her and you should hire her." So Lorne's like, "Absolutely." And she did have a kind of an entree to a sort of glamorous New York showbiz world that he found useful. And during those negotiations in that fifth season, when he was thinking about, maybe I'll leave the show and just start my movie career, he had been talking with her about joining him and being his lieutenant. Because, again, she was somebody who, to use a good Lorne word, she was good in a room, good in a room with fancy people and connected. So he was counting on her being on his team if he did leave the show and light out for the movies. So the double deceit of his own network kind of pulling this fast one on him, and then his own lieutenant being the person to, it was an Eve Harrington kind of vibe. And he's very careful about this because I would try to be careful in my book. I wouldn't want it to come off as sexist, but Domanian was completely the wrong person. Lorne had an interesting analysis for why it didn't work, but also why the network gravitated toward her. And it's because she was a talent booker. And if you're booking the talent, it's an outward facing role. She wore nice clothes to work. Her hair was combed. She took talent out to nice restaurants. She sent the flowers and the limos. She had excellent people skills compared to like the savages, in the writer's room. And I mean, even when I worked on the new show, I mean, I wouldn't say I tied people's shoelaces, but there's definitely a level of just executive function, dysfunction among these comic geniuses. I mean, they just don't, they don't present that well. To the suits. And so Lorne said, I could see how the network would have thought, oh, well, she's a grown-up. She knows how to do this. But as Lorne said, she had never been in the writer's room. She had never worked with the talent, with the creative people. And as you know, the heart of that show from the very beginning for Lorne was the writers, and the writers being given free rein, not just in terms of their ideas, but then producing their sketches, casting them. And to not be able to, the one of Lorne's geniuses is just knowing how tight to keep, or loose rather, to keep the reins. And so to put someone in that job who had never, didn't know how to speak the language of the writer's room was a complete disaster. So it just sounds like that was one of the worst periods of his life. He was personally really hurt. And then NBC gave him this kind of little lame-o kind of holding contract to do some things with him. And they had asked him to produce a pre-election special in August. So we kind of got the band back together to do that. And then Silverman, again, it's not clear whether this was just vengeance. They didn't air it. They didn't air it for some reason. And then Silverman said, well, we'll run it after the election.
This is a great quote in your book.
Might be crude or not.
Yeah, no, this is a great quote. I just read it last night again.
And so Michael O'Donoghue, what is the actual line? Wait. Oh, it's sort of like seeing the porn after you've come or something.
Yeah, or seeing a naked woman after you come, something like that.
Michael
Yeah.
O'Donoghue was the writer on it, which was completely apt. They were just messing with Lorne's head, and he got really depressed, and then I remember he told me that he was in Paris celebrating his birthday the next season when Jean Doumanian's first show aired. And, I don't know, I guess he was with Susan Forrestal, and I don't know if the idea was to be out of the country, different time zone. I mean, he didn't watch it, didn't read about it, was not interested, even I don't even think there was a kind of Schadenfreude. He just wanted to hide under the pillow.
Yeah, and then he does gather himself, and then he goes on and right. Let's talk a little bit about Lorne's post SNL time.
Well, yeah, I would say one of my favorite parts of Lorne's life to research was the hiatus years. People also called them the King Lear years. After SNL, he kind of bounced back. He took his most beloved writers and deputies, and he had rented a couple floors in the Brill Building where he set up Broadway Video.
Mm-hmm.
And he brought Jim Downey, Franken and Davis, Sarah Paley, George Meyer, a bunch of people over there, and set them all up with movie deals because he had he was going to start his mini studio. And again, one after another, these things just came to nothing. I mean, Tom Gamble and Max Pross were also there. They wrote a script about a comedy about people who were really tiny. I think it was called They or Them or something. And that was funny, but it never made it. And then Franken and Davis and Downey wrote a script called 1985, which was sort of an Orwell parody because it was getting close. And that script also was very good. But one of the things that happened there is those guys took so long to write it that it kind of became obsolete by the time they could do a table read with it. 85 was right around the corner. And then, what else? Then there was, the one film that got made was Tom Schiller's film, Nothing Lasts Forever, which is, your listeners might know, this kind of never seen underground cult classic, along the lines of Jerry Lewis's The Day the Clown Cried, his Holocaust comedy.
I just saw it a few months ago.
Saw it?
There was a secret screening with Tom in the city.
Oh my God, I can't believe no one invited me. Where was it?
It was at the Roxy downtown. They've got a cinema in the Roxy Hotel.
Oh man.
Yeah, it was interesting. It was fun.
Wow. Well, that's great. I'm so sorry I didn't get to see it. I mean, I guess I did end up having to cut a fair amount of this out of my book, but watching Lorne navigate the power of the studio, and this was a different Freddie Fields, who was a capricious, I think, coke-addled Hollywood guy who was on the way down. Watching him navigate that during the production of Nothing Lasts Forever is a really instructive little vignette because, again, Lorne, the live TV thing suits him so well. As Downey always said, the thing you have to know about Lorne is, great at exams, terrible at term papers. Like if there's a hard deadline, like a live show, he's going to be great. But if he can fiddle around with it and change his mind and re-edit it, it's going to kind of fall apart. So he found after his sort of, unquestioned power running a live television broadcast, the whole studio system was very frustrating for him. And again, this is sort of a combination of, there was a real naivete to that film. Like, they shot this whole film. It wasn't expensive or anything, but they didn't seem to even know that, because of, I guess, Ghostbusters was in the works, they weren't allowed to advertise that they had Danny Aykroyd and Bill Murray in it, And again, the studio wanted the SNL movie. They wanted a big Boffo movie. And what they got with Tom Schiller was a strange little indie black and white curio. So they just never even released it. I mean, there was a commercial release for like a couple of days in Seattle or something, and Tom Schiller found some teenage fans of SNL to put up posters around town. That was So anyway, the other thing during these wilderness hiatus years is after these movie things started kind of not really panning out the way he hoped, the Pride and Prejudice script, went nowhere. He optioned Don DeLillo's White Noise, which Noah Baumbach, recently made into, I think, a very interesting film. And he and his friend John Head were working on the script to White Noise. But, it just didn't work. None of this worked. And so when Brandon Tartikoff of NBC asked him if he wanted to come back and do television, at first he thought, and then he decided, why not? And so he had the same cast of characters, all those writers that I talked about. He got Buck Henry, Alan Zweibel, to do the new show. And this is where I come on the scene. I worked as Jim Downey's assistant on that show. I was 23. And the idea was that it would be just like SNL, but it would be in prime time. And it would be taped and edited. And that was a really interesting experience because the talent was so fantastic. There was probably the best writer's room in history. Jack Handy was there, Billy's brother, John Murray, George Meyer, Sarah Paley, Franken Davis, Gamlin Pross. It was great. And one problem is that to co-host it, Lorne asked his old Canadian friends, Dave Thomas and Valerie Bromfield, who were really talented Second City players. But at this point, they were kind of middle-aged, and they were sort of bland. If you think about the makeup of the first season of SNL, I mean, there was almost a kind of an ethnic edginess to it with Belushi and Gilda. And I mean, even, I was 23, and to me, Dave Thomas and Valerie Bromfield just seemed kind of like, people in the PTA carpool. I mean, they were so uncool. They were nice and funny.
That's alongside Buck, yeah.
Yeah, they just were beige, kind of.
Yeah.
It was kind of a big SCTV love fest because John Candy was on the show a lot. Catherine O'Hara was on the show a lot. Fantastic. So all the talent was there, but the show never, it finished last in the ratings, of the whole season. And part of the problem was that it was shot on tape. I remember being in these, and I had never done anything in television, so it was all completely new to me. And we'd be in the studio, and Lorne would call cut in the middle of a sketch, and they would start it up again. And sometimes these tapings took 3 or 4 hours, and the studio audience was locked in. So by the end, they were really mad. No one was laughing. And then they would stay up all night at Broadway Video, trying to edit this stuff together. It lost all the sizzle, all of the fun. It makes you realize how much of SNL, how much of the pleasure of it is that it's live, and the daring, and the doing it without a net. And they had to add laugh tracks, because all the cuts were so that was a disaster, and it got canceled after 9 shows. And Lorne had put his own money into it, so he was really at the end of his rope after that. The Hollywood thing had fizzled. He had to remortgage his apartment. I mean, he was getting divorced. It was really the lowest point ever. And I mean, the one happy thing is that he had a good time writing the script for The Three Amigos with his 2 close friends, Steve Martin and Randy Newman. And so that was in production around this time. And he did like that. But still, the whole thing, as I said, people were calling it his King Lear period. And so then, even after the, terrible disaster of the new show, Tartikoff at NBC called him and said, listen, we really want you to come back and do SNL. He had been off for 5 seasons. There was the one terrible Jean Doumanian year, which was a disaster. She got fired right away. And then Dick Ebersol, who had been the kind of corporate suit who helped Lorne set it up in the beginning, he was brought in to do the Lorne job. And, friends who worked on that show say that Ebersol was a very, orderly, organized boss. But he was not a funny guy. And one of the things they respected him for is that he would say, I don't know if this is funny. You tell me. He was a little bit more of a functionary. So anyway, Ebersol wanted to leave. And at this point, Lorne knew, this is their property. They could just kill it. And so they said, we'd really like you to come back and do SNL. And he was so beaten down. I think he still had these Hollywood dreams that maybe he could be, still have his auteur moment. And he asked two mentors for their advice. The first person he asked was David Geffen, who was his contemporary, but had been, he was a mogul by this time, but Geffen had been one of his earliest agents back in Canada when he was, writing gags for Joan Rivers. And Geffen said, you shouldn't do that. That's going backwards. Don't do that. You should be moving in another direction. You should move forward. And Geffen said, you don't want to do that. Somebody who wants to be you should do that. And Lorne's typical kind of Lorne reply to that is, well, I always kind of liked being me. So the second person he asks is Mo Austin, much older than he is and wiser, the chairman of Warner Brothers. And Lorne always gravitated toward these menschy older Jews who could be these kind of rabbinical rabbi figures for him. His father died when he was 14. These kind of guys were really important in his life. And Mo said to him, there's no shame in going back. You like living in New York. There are very few big showbiz jobs in New York. You know how to do this. You're good at it. It'll make you happy. There's no shame in it. And, thank goodness that's what he did. He went back.
The only other thing we wanted to ask you about the wilderness years, and you write in the book, I think it's known, or people know, that before Ebersol took the job, he got Lorne's blessing. But what I had forgotten was, and you write about this, that Lorne goes back. Like, it's not even a year after he leaves the show. He's back in his old office, Dick's office in 8H. So he still kind of left his imprint there a little bit. And you write something which I had forgotten. It was interesting about how he convinced Dick Ebersol to do Lorne a favor by Lorne doing him a favor of bringing Michael O'Donoghue on as the head writer. And I was just curious how much Lorne, aside from that, was paying attention, or not involved, but just in the imprint of Dick's world while Dick was running the show at all.
I think he really was standing. I think he was really standing back. I think he was happy that the thing wasn't killed, wasn't taken off the air. I'm sure, even though he never said this to me, I'm sure it must have given him some pleasure when it wasn't great. I'm sure he wouldn't have wanted it to be great. Like, it was fine. It kept the franchise going. So, I mean, there's never any question in Lorne's mind that he was a smarter, classier, more creative mind than Dick Ebersol. Dick Ebersol is kind of a caretaker, I suppose. And, after the stormy relations they had in the first season, I think Lorne appreciated that Dick was a caretaker. But I don't think he was monitoring it. I mean, I definitely remember at the new show, and this was my first sort of understanding of how the original group viewed the Ebersol group. One of the things that I did as the writer's assistant there would be these massive boxes of submissions, people wanting to write on the new show. And, it wasn't very systematic, but the writers would kind of go read through these and write generally very mean comments on them, And I remember learning a fair amount from just like somebody would write, "This is even worse than the Gene Domanian season." And they were, the writers probably were paying attention, and, and they could be mean.
Yeah.
It's like, this is like Ebersol's third season. There was a real hierarchy in their head. And that was fascinating to me, right? That they had stratified it all that way. And there was definitely some rivalry, snobbery, something that I didn't really think about until I was working on the book. So at the new show, the first few shows, we taped it in CBS at this huge soundstage, a vast soundstage. It didn't have any of the intimacy of 8H. And I think Lorne got it into his head that one of the reasons the show wasn't working was because of that setup. The way the cameras were, they didn't have the crane cameras, all the signature SNL production moves. So he persuaded Ebersol to let the new show use Studio 8H. We would tape the new show on Thursday night and it would air on Friday. But knowing what I know now about the clockwork use of the studio space, of the time, everything, of how the show works, like it's kind of amazing. Like we would all move over there maybe on Wednesday. We would work in 8H on Wednesday and Thursday. And I don't know where all those Ebersol people went. Like we were using their desks. We were in there. It
Right.
seems incredibly generous.
Interesting.
Right. And also,
Yeah.
logistically, it's hard for me to figure out how they or we even made it happen. Again, I was
Yeah.
Munchkin. I didn't know anything.
Right.
But, the way it is now, I don't think there's ever a moment, those spaces are occupied 24 hours a day by
Right.
people.
Yeah.
And we would go in there. It's not as if there were SNL people loitering around, the writer. Lorne was back sitting at his old desk, which was now Ebersol's desk,
Oh, wow.
doing the show out of the same studio. It must have been kind of a mind fuck for everybody.
That's crazy.
So yeah,
That's insane.
yeah, that was interesting.
Well, thanks so much, Susan, for talking to us.
Thank you, Susan, for doing this and for helping us put this little bow on, the end of the first 5 years and kind of, what happens after that, right? Because I think that's very important
Yeah.
to the whole story of the first 5 years.
Absolutely.
Well, and we wanted to happily congratulate you on the book. We should say,
Yeah.
Lorne, it just went into paperback
Yeah.
a few weeks ago, so congratulations. I actually saw it in the store, and I was waiting to see, thought I'd see either the sticker or a new cover that said, soon to be a major motion picture, since it's coming out. But I guess not. I guess,
Well, as long as it says New York Times bestseller on it, that's fine.
yes. But
Yeah.
we talked to you before the book came out last year, so
Yeah.
been really great just to see how well it's gone and people have enjoyed
Well,
it.
it was a shocker to me, and a pleasant surprise.
I don't know. After we read it, and I am not surprised at all. Like we said when we talked to you the first time, it's an amazing book. What kind of reaction have you gotten either from Lorne or people from SNL itself?
The nicest thing is that everybody from SNL just says, "Oh my God, you really got him. You really got him," because he's so elusive. I did Seth Meyers' show, and Fred was on it, and they were both just ran into the dressing room. It's so good, we just can't believe it, And
Yeah.
there were people like when Simon Rich and Mulaney were reading it, they were just texting me like every 50 pages. That was so gratifying. So nobody has said, "No, you really missed this," or "You really followed this up." And with Lorne, his stance is that he hasn't read the book. We text now. We text, we're in touch,
Uh-huh.
and what he does is, especially toward the beginning, he would text me or call me whenever his like fancy friends, he'll say, "Mick loved it," or he recommended, he said, "Peyton Manning has bought several copies. He really liked it. Candy Bergen thinks it's great," and Lorne's former brother-in-law, Joe Forrestal, Lorne came to, David Remnick had a really nice book party for me when it came, and Lorne came, and he I think he's happy that the book is a success. And when it's gotten nominated for prizes and things, I sent him a text. I said, "This is, this reflects well on you and your story," and he loves that it's seen as, that it isn't just like a showbiz book, but that it's a real book.
Mhm.
But no, people in his circle say, "Oh, he's probably read it." These kind of people always say they haven't read the book.
Right.
Whatever. I don't really care. Most people close to him feel that I captured the mystery to the extent that you can.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's great. If I don't know anybody who wouldn't already have it, but if you haven't, it's out in
Oh, wait,
paperback
here's
now.
one great thing that I love. Somebody on the SNL staff sent me a photo right after the book came out of several cartons of the book open on Lorne's assistants' desks that they had bought in bulk. So I like that.
Wow. That's great.
Well, Susan, thank you so much for doing this
Thank
and
you
talking
again.
to us again. It was great.
Really fun. Yeah.
Really appreciate it. Well, Brad, that was an amazing conversation with Susan. We went into more than I
Some
expected
great
even.
story. I know. I was not expecting all the news show conversations. That was great.
Yeah, it was really good. It was really interesting and great to get, that perspective from Lorne of, what was going on with him around that time.
Yep. As we mentioned, Susan's book, Lorne, the Man Who Invented Saturday Night Live, is in paperback now, so check it out. I know there's a documentary coming out in a few weeks or months. I would put money on it. You'll learn more from this book than you will the documentary. So if you're interested in Lorne Michaels, her book, chronicles Lorne's entire life up, till about a few years ago through the 50th. So if you're intrigued about it and you're excited about the Lorne Michaels documentary and you haven't read this book, go grab it because the book is fantastic.
And it just came out in paperback, which we talked about with Susan. So definitely worth a read. I know. I'm just reiterating it because people tune you out like I did.
That's fair. Well, you don't have much longer to tune out. What do we got? Next week will be the end, everybody. If you've been on this journey, the final episode of the early years will be out next week. We're going to wrap up our coverage of the entire 5 seasons, look back on it all. So check that out.
Yes, it'll be fun. I'm looking forward to that. Until then, good night and have a pleasant tomorrow.
Good night and have a pleasant tomorrow.
Thanks for listening to the Not Ready for Primetime Project. Please remember to rate and review and follow us on social media everywhere at NR4PT Project. The Not Ready for Primetime Project team is Brad Robinson and Gary Seith. Our editor is Will Bond, who hosts his own podcast with his brothers, Reviewing Doctor Who, which you can find wherever you're listening to this. Thanks for listening. Good night and have a pleasant tomorrow.
Brad, why do you do this? Do you do this to hurt us?